Here's just one quote from the Populist era, from a group called the Knights of Labor. And there were lots of groups. This is pre-mass communication. You couldn't phone across the country yet. You couldn't take a train across the country yet. So organizing was very, very local, as you can imagine. And so these groups are popping up literally all over the country. Every city, every town had groups that were calling themselves the Knights of Labor, or the Greenbackers, or the Populists, or the Grangers. There were lots of names for these groups. But the Knights of Labor was a labor uprising. And here's a quote from the Knights of Labor. "You can't have a democracy when one group accumulates profits and the other works for wages." Is that extraordinary? Now, if we took that on in this movement, and we started seeing ourselves as allies of everyone out there who feels or really is, a slave of the wage system, what an extraordinary movement that would be too. And if we learned our labor history, because the reality is that almost everybody works. Whether we call ourselves workers or not, we work. And most of us probably don't think of ourselves as working class or part of the labor movement. But if we did, that would also be a very exciting stretch for us to be taking. For 30 or 40 years, Americans generally believed that if you had to work under someone else as a waged worker, then you could not expect that person to be fully participating in the democracy that people were really trying hard to create. I mean, we've moved back a huge step from that, have we not? It's really something. I want to read to you a short excerpt from one of my colleagues and mentors, who is a public interest attorney in Pennsylvania, Thomas Lindsay, and he just co-authored a book called Be the Change, about this extraordinary popular uprising that's going on in more than 100 rural communities in Pennsylvania, Virginia, New Hampshire, and Maine. It says, "Last year someone asked me why, after decades of work, billions of dollars, the work of thousands of communities, and the involvement of the largest environmental groups, that things are worse now than they've ever been. I answered, it's because we've never had an environmental movement in this country. When I've said that before, depending on the audience, I almost always hear loud gasps, but I believe it's true. We've never had an environmental movement in this country. What we've had is groups and people resisting one factory farm at a time, one toxic waste incinerator at a time, one road project at a time, one asphalt plant at a time. We've been playing defense. And as anyone who plays strategic games like chess will tell you, if you're always reacting, you're going to lose the game. People's movements, on the other hand, are driven by communities unwilling to accept such a defensive role for themselves. People's movements are about moving beyond defense. They focus instead on fixing the problems of governance that consistently shove them onto the defense in the first place. They question why the law is not on their side. People's movements recognize that the current framework of governance has rendered them remediless, and that the only solution available to them is to create new remedies by changing the plan of governance that placed them on the defensive. It's not easy work. Our culture makes it that much harder. Awards are given to those who work within the regulatory system to reduce adverse environmental harms from projects. Foundations give money to those groups who can show a track record of success by appealing permits and improving regulations. True people's movements are thus few and far between, and emerge only in response to serious crises that have erupted in this nation, when the denial of rights to slaves and women was deemed incompatible with all men are created equal, when an English king and his trading corporations made self-government impossible, and when denial of rights to African Americans led to the civil rights movement. Movements thus seek to drive rights into the Constitution, our framework of governance in these United States. Past people's movements have thrust groups of people into the protections of our framework of governance. Mountains, lakes, rivers, whales, trees, raccoons, oceans, salmon, wolves, plants, and ecosystems have no rights under our framework of governance. They have no rights, no legal protections. Under the law, animals, plants, ecological systems, water and air, they're property, and that's how they're treated. At one time in this nation's history, people were also property.